The first bombs of World War II were dropped on the 1st of September 1939 by Junkers Ju.87 Stuka dive bombers during the invasion of Poland, and the last Luftwaffe ground assault missions against the Soviet tanks took place on the 5th of May 1945 as part of the defence of Berlin, also by Stuka dive bombers. This little bomber, as the Germans called it, bookended the start and the end of the war in Europe. Similarly, in the Pacific War against Japan, the US used the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers to destroy 5 out of the 8 Japanese fleet carriers and a 6th light carrier, as well as entrenched enemy positions during the island-hopping pushback of the Japanese to their home islands, and in doing so changed the course of the war in favour of the US. Both aircraft were key to the progress of the war for their respective sides because they could do what artillery or heavy bombing could not, and that was to hit often moving, high-value targets with great accuracy, with just one pilot and one small plane. So in this video we'll look at 2 aircraft that were hardly stellar performers when they entered service, and yet they ended up as 2 of the most influential aircraft of World War II. Now, whilst I cover a lot of military history in videos like this, if you lived through World War II, then your news sources would be much less than they are now, and would have been tightly controlled by the government of the country where you lived, and in many cases with a huge amount of propaganda and fake news even back then. Today we have news from everywhere, 24/7, covered from every single viewpoint, be that left, right or centre, and some would say with just as much or even more fake news. So finding news sources that you can trust to be factual without all the spin can be just overwhelming, but this is where Ground News comes in. Ground News is an app and website developed by former NASA engineer Harleen Kaur in 2018 and is now the world's largest news source, but with a unique feature. In a nutshell, Ground News takes news articles from over 50,000 sources around the world and then pulls them all together in one place. But more importantly, it shows who the sources are, their political leaning, who owns them, where they are based, and their factuality based on reporting practices. To give an example, here's a report of a US military aircraft crashing in the Eastern Mediterranean just over a day ago. Here on the right, you can see the coverage details, the number of sources, and how recent the updates are. Then the political bias of those sources, left, centre or right-leaning. Here they are mostly right-leaning. Below that is the factuality score, which is quite high, and who owns the source. Here they are mostly media conglomerates. Just click on any one of the sources to see the article. Or you can look on the left of a page to skim through the headlines of the articles to see how each of the news sources is framing the news, and go to the articles from there. You can also search the subject of articles you're looking for, be that current news events, people, politics, basically any type of topic, and build them into your own following feed, or just browse the news for what interests you in particular. To find out more and access data-driven information from around the world, go to ground.news/Droid, the link is in the description below, and if you subscribe through my link, you can get Ground News for as little as $1 a month or 40% off unlimited access for this month only. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Junkers Ju.87 was already slow, outmoded and out of date, and yet it would prove to be a decisive weapon when used alongside German panzer tanks, artillery and mechanised infantry in what became known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. This was a method of fast but overwhelming combined arms force that could manoeuvre quickly to find weak points in the enemy's defences. This was so effective that it broke through the defensive lines across Western Europe, and in just 9 months from the 1st of September 1939 to the 22nd of June 1940, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and France surrendered to the German forces, leaving just Great Britain alone and isolated, ready to be the next target. This Lightning War wasn't a German invention. In fact, it was the British Royal Flying Corps that pioneered the technique of strafing, utilising diving aircraft armed with machine guns and small bombs as a strategic manoeuvre. This was first used to great effect by the British at the Battle of Cambrai on the 20th of November 1917, where 320 Mark IV tanks and 300 aircraft, mostly Sopwith Camels and Airco DH-5s with 9.1 kilogram bombs, were used to suppress artillery and machine guns. Although up to 30% of the pilots were lost, the overall effect was very successful. The results were later published by the Royal Tank Corps, which was later picked up by Heinz Guderian, who would become the architect not only of the Panzer divisions, but also what would become known to the Allies as the Blitzkrieg method. Although the British had initially used dive bombing, the high-costing pilots put them off the technique for nearly 20 years, whereas the Americans, Germans and Japanese all went on to develop their own dive bombing aircraft and tactics. After World War I, Germany was strictly limited under the Versailles Treaty as to what armaments could and could not be built on German soil. Despite the Nazi Party ousting its founder, Hugo Junkers, in 1933, the Junkers Aircraft and Motor Works established a factory in neutral Sweden. Here they built the K-47, a heavily strutted and braced radial-engined monoplane fighter, initially for Turkey, but eventually sold to China's Nanking government. The K-47 was optimised for diving, with Junkers dive brakes and an automatic dive pull-out mechanism, was pivotal in developing dive bombing techniques in Sweden for the German company. Hermann Pohlmann, the designer of the K-47, later adapted it into the Ju-87, a dive bomber with the nickname Stuka, which is a shortened form of the German word Sturzkampfflugzeug, meaning diving fighter aircraft. Pohlmann thought that any dive bomber design needed to be simple and robust, and to that end modern retractable undercarriage was discarded in favour of fixed spatted undercarriage. The early designs used a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, though by 1936 it had been replaced by the UMO 210 inverted V12 engine. The wing was also unusual in that it had an inverted gull or cranked wing pattern along the leading edge. This improved the pilot's ground visibility and also allowed for shorter undercarriage height. Attached to the leading edges of the landing gear were ram air sirens known as the Jericho trumpets, which became a propaganda symbol for German air power and the Blitzkrieg victories of 1939-42, although by 1943 these had been replaced by wind whistles on the fins of the Stuka's bombs. Meanwhile, in 1933, Ernst Udet joined the Nazi Party. Udet, a World War I fighter ace who had the second largest number of kills after the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. Udet was being enticed back by his old commander, Hermann Göring, to join the newly formed Luftwaffe. By 1935, Udet had already been to America and seen the US Navy Curtiss F-11C2 Goshawk biplane dive bombers and was greatly impressed by their performance and was keen for the Luftwaffe to use the same capabilities, and by 1939 was the Chief of Procurement and Supply for the Luftwaffe. Udet admired the Stuka, but the head of the Reich Aviation Ministry, Wolfram von Richthofen, the Red Baron's cousin, thought it was out of date, slow, and would not survive the anti-aircraft guns it would come up against compared to the newer fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 that was in development at the time. So on the 9th of June 1936, Richthofen cancelled the Ju-87 programme, even though it had been awarded top marks and was about to be accepted by the ministry. The very next day, Udet was appointed Chief of the Technical Office of the Reich Aviation Ministry and reversed the order. The Stuka first saw occasional service use in the Spanish Civil War and proved that it was a useful weapon. The Stuka was one of only a few dive bombers that could actually dive vertically without exceeding the absolute permitted speed limit, due to the dive brakes, bluff chin radiator, large wheel pants, and the upright cockpit canopy. It was really quite a draggy aircraft. British test pilot Erik Winkle-Brown described flying a captured Ju-87D as exhilarating, especially its 90-degree dive, which felt almost over vertical and controlled compared to other dive bombers that typically only reached 70 degrees. He said that when flying the Stuka, because it was all automatic, you're really flying vertically, and the Stuka really was in a class of its own. Although an excellent dive bomber in the Battle of Britain, it was used as a strategic bomber instead of a tactical bomber. Stukas were ground support aircraft designed to work in tandem with tanks in areas where the Luftwaffe held complete air superiority. They were not conventional fighter bombers where they had to deal with modern enemy fighters. The RAF soon found its weakness, as after it had finished its dive, it was slow to recover and gain altitude, something that the Hurricanes and Spitfires, with their 165 km or 100 mile an hour speed advantage, could just come in and mop them up, destroying them by the dozen. After the Battle of Britain, the RAF said that the Stuka was finished as an offensive weapon, and yet it operated right up until the end of the war, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied merchant ships and warships, which it proved to be very effective at. In the opening days of the Russian offensive, Operation Barbarossa, Stukas were credited with destroying over 2,000 aircraft and nearly destroying the Western Soviet Air Force. For Operation Barbarossa as a whole, Stuka Group STG-77 with 300 aircraft and the most effective of the war alone destroyed 2,401 vehicles, 234 tanks, 92 artillery batteries, 21 trains for the loss of 25 Stukas. Overall, in the Russian offensive and the retreat back to Germany, the Stukas were credited with destroying over 3,500 Soviet tanks, 10 warships, and thousands of other pieces of hardware. But the Soviets could build more tanks and aircraft faster than the Germans, and with more modern Soviet fighters like the Yak-3 and the La-7, they regained air superiority, pushing the Germans back. Although by 1945 the Ju-87 was largely replaced by the ground attack versions of a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Stukas remained a potent weapon, especially in the defence of Berlin, where for 3 months they were able to hold off the Red Army, but with depleted fuel reserves and in the end the collapse of the German war machine after Hitler committed suicide, the war in Europe was over. While the Stukas had proved their worth in Europe, the Japanese proved that their main dive bomber, the Aichi D3A Val, was equally good at tactical strikes when the Japanese sent 54 D3A Valves carrying 550 250 kilogram bombs to attack parked aircraft at Wheeler Field and Ford Island during the attack at Pearl Harbor. The Americans' main dive bomber was the Douglas SBD Dauntless, the SBD standing for Scout Bomber Douglas, although after the Battle of Midway it was known as Slow but Deadly. The SBD had started off as a Northrop XBT-1 in 1936, which had a reputation as an ill-handling dive bomber. By the time Douglas had taken over the Northrop Company in 1937, the XBT-1 designer, Ed Hyman, had fixed its failings and developed into a much improved XBT-2, which was a direct forerunner to the Dauntless. Although made for carrier operations, Hyman didn't use a folding wing design, saying he wanted the strongest possible wing for 5G plus pullouts. But by the advent of the Pearl Harbor attacks, the SBD was a slow-dated pre-war design that had been used as a trainer before an engine upgrade gave it more speed, but it was still slow by the standards of the day and vulnerable to fighters, even though it was robustly made. However, it did have one redeeming quality in that it was a very good dive bomber that was easy to make precise downline corrections in a dive, making it very accurate. Part of this was due to the use of perforated dive brakes to eliminate tail flutter during diving manoeuvres, making it easy to make and hold its position in a dive. This was used to great effect during the Battle of Midway, when on the 4th of June 1942, the US fleet engaged the Japanese carriers, first with 41 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, of which 35 were shot down and no torpedoes hit their targets. Shortly after, a squadron of SBDs were looking for the Japanese carriers, which were obscured by cloud. Then, through a gap in the cloud, they spotted the Akagi and the Kaga. At 10:25 a.m, 30 SBDs from the USS Enterprise attacked both carriers, and in a matter of minutes they were both on fire. At the same time, 17 SBDs from the USS Yorktown attacked the carrier Soryu. At 1 a.m, the carrier Hiryu was detected and 24 SBDs set off to attack it. At 4:10, the Soryu sank, and at 7:25 p.m. the Kaga sank. The next day, the 5th of July, at 5 a.m. the Akagi sank, and at 9 a.m. the Hiryu sank. The SBDs had done what the Americans' biggest battleships couldn't do, and that was decimate the Japanese carrier fleet, taking with them 248 aircraft and 3,075 personnel, many of which were veteran aircrew, highly trained aircraft mechanics and technicians, plus essential flight deck crews, armourers, and the loss of the organisational knowledge that these highly trained crews had. The Battle of Midway marked a pivotal shift in the significance of air power for the rest of the war, as the Japanese unexpectedly lost their 4 primary aircraft carriers, forcing them to retreat. This loss of air dominance meant that Japan was unable to initiate any significant offensives in the Pacific afterwards. Although the 2 aircraft were very different and were used in different theatres of war, the effect each had was definitive, whether or not they were on the winning side or not. They both had a major impact on the course of World War II. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, share and subscribe. And a big thank you goes to all our patrons for their ongoing support.